Hello and welcome to Soothing Pod Sleep Stories. My name is Anthony, and today I would like to help you relax and fall asleep, guided by my voice and the story you are about to hear. Tonight, we will take a relaxing, romantic journey out into Joshua Tree National Park. We will experience rolling mountains, the fresh desert landscape, and the warmth of a strong connection between two people. But before we begin, let us take a moment to unwind and find comfort in the space we are in. Get into a comfortable position in your bed. It can be lying on your back, on your side, or even on your stomach. The key is to make sure you feel totally and completely relaxed. There are no expectations of you here. There is nothing for you to do but breathe in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out. Imagine every piece of your body connected by a warm light. The warm light trails from the very tips of your toes, up your calves, up your thighs, through your stomach, through your chest, all the way up, through your shoulders into your head. Imagine that light as a river. You want that glowing river to flow effortlessly. It shouldn't be pooling in places. It shouldn't be catching on kinks or slowing down in areas that ache or are tense. Relax the areas where you feel the river isn't flowing. Picture the glowing river moving seamlessly, slowly and effortlessly from the tips of your toes to the top of your head. Let this calm, constant flow of energy release the tension from your body. Now that we've taken the time to relax, let us begin. The drive out into the desert always feels like the beginning of something magical. You see civilization fading behind you, replaced by rolling copper hills that pop against the cloudless blue sky. You watch in awe as the buildings and billboards are slowly replaced by sagebrush, cacti, and brittlebush. It feels so distant from the stresses and trials of everyday life. It feels like one of the few places where we can be free, untethered, and truly ourselves. Celeste felt that exact way as her car rolled down the long, winding desert roads. Elliot, her husband, sat in the driver's seat, tapping his fingers rhythmically against the steering wheel. In fact, there was a lot of rhythm around them. The sound of the tires whirring against the asphalt. The pitter-patter of tiny gusts of wind kicking sand against the side of the car. The mechanic drone of the engine. They hadn't taken this trip in years, not since the first time they met. Celeste felt a bubble of anticipation and the sweet, sweet feel of nostalgia inside her. After college, she wasn't ready to settle down. She wanted to explore the world, to sit under starry night skies with campfires, to dine in diners at the edge of sweetly named towns, to read books at the edge of rivers and at the top of mountains. So, instead of going the usual path, she decided to head out into the world for a national parks trip. Her very first stop was Joshua Tree National Park, where her life changed forever. There, she went on a solo hike on a wonderful, breezy spring day. She followed the desert path past cacti, past Joshua trees, and through stunning fields of fleeting wildflowers. She didn't mind being alone. She enjoyed the feeling of the breeze on her face and had comfort in her own company. Then it happened. She reached the end of the hiking path and Elliot was standing there, catching his breath. As he looked over the impressive vista before them, she simply wandered up and stood beside him. They looked over the landscape below them in silence. No words needed to be exchanged. No words could truly explain what they were looking at, or what they were both feeling in that very moment. But there, at the top of that vista, they were connected. They felt drawn to one another, forever tied by sharing that beautiful instant together. Only at the time, they didn't realize how much that was true. They walked back down the path together. Soon the words were flowing freely, drifting through the air with ease. They laughed. To her surprise, he was also on the road, trying to see as much of the world as he could. When they got back, they both crawled into Celeste's van. It wasn't much. A cozy cab with a queen bed, piled high in soft blankets, made of fleece, cotton and wool. They lay in that bed for hours into the night, with the sunroof open, talking in hushed whispers as they watched the stars make their way lazily across the inky black sky. By morning, they were still talking. They looked out the window and watched the sun paint the desert landscape in reds, oranges, pinks and yellows. From that day on, they were inseparable. What was meant to be 2 solo journeys became the journey of a lifetime. They hiked through icy teal rivers in Zion National Park. They stood in awe at the base of massive sequoias in Kings Canyon National Park. They cuddled at the base of a lighthouse on the rocky coast of Maine in Acadia National Park. And in between, they drank hot chocolate at tiny, run-down diners in the middle of prairies. They ate salsa at bars down dirt roads in the southwest. They held each other surrounded by those blankets of cotton and fleece and wool, until they fell asleep and readied themselves for the next adventure. All of it was beautiful. All of it led to them being in the car on their way to Joshua Tree with wedding rings on their fingers and anniversary presents in their back seat. Before Celeste even realized it, they were driving through the eclectic town of Joshua Tree. Wooden storefronts with vintage signs lined the streets. She thought fondly of wandering through aisles of antiques, all inspired by the West. They passed by coffee shops, and Celeste felt her mouth water. She almost wanted to stop for a cup of something sweet, but she knew they had hot chocolate in the back seat. It always tasted better over a campfire anyway. Soon the town of Joshua Tree faded behind them, and the wonder that is Joshua Tree National Park came into view. It is truly unlike any place on earth. It is sparse, yet teeming with nature and incredible elements that can only be found within the park. Joshua trees pepper the landscape, their twisted branches seemingly reaching for the sunlight above. Found only in the southeastern US and Mexico, the trees are always a breathtaking sight. And though they are the park's namesake, they weren't Celeste's favourite part of the park. Once they passed the entrance gate, the slow descent into the Lost Horse Valley began. All around, boulders and rock formations stick out of the desert like art pieces. Some rocks seem impossibly tall, made up of dozens of smooth rocks, all clamoured together as if they were placed there by an expressionist artist. Together with the Joshua trees, it makes for an environment unlike any other, and truly it is. Joshua Tree National Park is made up of two separate deserts that merge together, the Colorado and the Mojave deserts, each with their own unique ecosystem. The stark change in elevation is evident from wherever you stand. The desert seems to stretch on for miles, each mountain and slope illuminated by the sun, painting them golden, tawny and orange. Celeste reached over, grabbing Elliot's hand. They would be turning soon to reach their campsite, and she felt the warm tingle of anticipation inside her. Elliot met her eyes, smiling, with one hand tightly on the wheel. They turned into Jumbo Rock's campground, driving down a thin road that wound around massive boulders. With tiny campsites tucked in between the rock, it almost felt like a playhouse for the adventurous. In between the rocks there were hidden arches, caves, and slopes that seemed to open up the imagination and encourage safe, slow exploration. Celeste couldn't help but smile as Elliot put the car in park. "I have a surprise," he said, his voice smooth and low. He took her by the hand, leading her out of the car. As they walked across the sand and gravel, Celeste felt a weight fall off her shoulders. She felt as though, with every step, she was transforming more and more into herself. The weight of society and expectations was dripping down into the sand around her feet, disappearing entirely. Elliot led her around the bend of one mountainous rock, and what came into view made her heart pause with delight and surprise. There was a tiny campsite, tucked into a U-shape in the rock. On either side, Joshua trees stood guard, reaching their long branches toward the sky. Low bushes nestled against the edge of the rocks, making the entire area feel cozy. Though it was in the middle of a large campsite, it felt miles away. Celeste and Elliot both meandered into the alcove and glanced out to see what their view would be for the night. The view was breathtaking. Miles and miles of hills and valleys in the desert, fenced in by blue mountains in the distance. It felt like something out of a movie, and it looked as though it was too pure for this world, as if it should be a painting hanging in a museum. The ease that Celeste felt only seemed to grow. She looked out over the mountains, then glanced to Elliot by her side. The sun illuminated his amber eyes, which were already filled with wonder as they took in the sights before them. She thought for a moment about all the things they had seen together, all the adventures they had experienced, all the soft beds they had slept in together in distant lands, and gratitude washed over her. She wrapped her hand around the back of Elliot's neck and pulled him against her lips. They kissed there, wrapped up in each other, feeling the warm desert sun on their skin and the crisp spring breeze brush through their hair. When they pulled apart, Celeste could see the gratitude showing in Elliot's eyes. They had found home for the night, and they both knew it was about to be an anniversary they would never forget. Hand in hand, the two walked back to the car to gather up their camping supplies and set everything up. There was always something so satisfying about opening the trunk of the car and seeing everything together there. The sleeping bags rolled up with care, the lanterns and cast iron skillets, and warm, fluffy blankets. Celeste swore she could still smell the brisk pine trees of Maine, the fragrant white daisies of Utah. and the earthy richness of towering sequoia trees on the blankets and sleeping bags. Together they unloaded the supplies and began their walk back to their camp. Elliot walked in front of Celeste with a sleeping bag over his shoulder and a cast iron skillet in each hand. She had seen that sight 1,000,000 times, but she never grew tired of it. They set up their tent with a rhythm that can only be found when two people spend a lot of time together. With ease, Celeste set the tent up, watching their home for the night grow before her very eyes. For this particular trip, they had a new addition: foam mats to line the bottom of the tent with. Knowing they wanted comfort, sleeping on top of the rocky sand of Joshua Tree National Park, they had picked the foam mats to turn their entire tent into a cozy sanctuary. With the mats down, the sleeping bags and blankets came next. The inside of the tent was wonderfully comfortable, with white plush blankets and soft, fluffy pillows. Celeste couldn't resist. She kicked off her shoes and sank into the nest they hand-made together. Elliot followed her, crawling into the tent with a smile on his face. There's a childlike wonder that comes with being in a tent, a sense of escape and belonging that is at the core of our very being. Elliot wrapped his arms around Celeste, pulling her against his chest. He closed his eyes as he rocked her gently, embracing the moment that they were sharing together. He could smell the rose shampoo in her hair, and he could feel the softness of her skin even after all the days of hiking and sleeping in strange places. He thought for a moment about how long he had waited for someone as wonderful as her. He thought about how different his life would be if he wasn't holding her in his arms at that very moment. And most of all, he thought about how he felt the first time she looked at him, the first time she smiled in his direction. He remembered the first night they had spent together in her camping van in this very park. They were lying in nearly the same position now, her hair in his face, her hands wrapped around his forearms. Somehow things felt exactly the same, yet so different at the same time. They had grown together, evolved together. They had experienced things across the country together, but at the same time, holding her in his arms felt brand new. He felt blessed and sometimes like he didn't know how he had gotten someone so incredible. Outside, they could hear the calls of the animals in the park, the melodic chirp of a rock wren, the soothing coo of mourning doves as they scuttled across the sand, looking for something to eat. And in between all of it, the gentle rustle of the sagebrush and the brittlebrush as they shifted in the wind, and birds flitted in and out of their branches. It was an otherworldly soundtrack, and the best part is, they couldn't hear the noises of civilization. They couldn't hear cars droning down the roads or blaring their horns. They couldn't hear the conversations of other people. They felt isolated in the most beautiful way. Nothing mattered in that tent or in that park except for each other. In their dreamy, peaceful state, they could both feel themselves drifting off. This time of year, in early spring, the temperatures were beautiful during the day. The tent felt perfect, like a warm cocoon, and the soft breeze on the tent only made it even more relaxing. The lull of sleep was washing over both of them, like a soothing wave, and it took them both a long moment to sit up and wipe the slumber from their eyes. They knew they'd be back in the tent with a chance to sleep later, for now there were things to see and experiences to be had. With their camp set up for the night, Elliot led Celeste to their first stop of the day, the trail they had met on all those years ago. And just like their first time, the trail was lined with wildflowers of all kinds. In the sparse desert, seeing wildflowers is something particularly magical. In Joshua Tree, the flowers only bloom for a few short weeks out of the year, turning the landscape into what resembles an impressionist painting. All around them, the land was painted in swaths of orange and purple and yellow. With every breeze, the landscape danced and whistled its familiar tune. The fragrant aroma of the flowers washed over them, filling them with a sense of relaxation and rejuvenation. They didn't talk much on their walk. In an environment this beautiful, with company this special, just taking in the moment is enough. They listened to the repetitive crunch, crunch, crunch of their hiking boots sinking into the gravel, like the soundtrack of their journey. But that wasn't the only sound. Around them, they could hear the wind whistling against the sand, and the birds' calls only seemed to grow stronger the deeper they journeyed into the fields of wildflowers. They watched the birds flit across the sky without a care in the world, sinking into the flowers and emerging yet again, sometimes with petals and pollen adorning their glossy feathers. It was like watching nature dance before their very eyes. Within the wildflowers, there were other surprises to be seen. The drone of happy bumblebees, bopping from one flower to the next, hummed in the air. Their flashes of yellow and black glowed against the purple lupine and bright orange poppies. They were going about their business in a breathtaking environment, and Celeste and Elliot felt fortunate to be even a little part of it. As they reached the end of the trail, Celeste smiled and pointed out into a large swath of flowers. In the middle of a patch of lupine, a desert black-tailed jackrabbit popped its head above the blossoms, twitching its long ears as it gazed at Celeste and Elliot with curiosity. They watched as it leaned down, taking the purple flowers into its mouth and nibbling on them happily. The purple seemed to glow against the fluffy, tawny fur on the rabbit. After another moment of nibbling and watching Celeste and Elliot from a distance, the rabbit leapt onto its haunches and skipped through the field of wildflowers, disappearing into the distance behind a tall red rock. Celeste squeezed Elliot's hand, seeing nature as it's meant to be seen, observing from a distance, yet close enough to feel its majesty, is a feeling that is hard to shake and even harder to forget. As they began the long walk back down the same trail, the sun began to dip down in the sky. Night was coming shortly, and it brought them both a sense of comfort and accomplishment. The whole walk back, they were able to gaze out over the landscape, watching as it transformed before their very eyes. Everything glistened in the setting sun. The blue mountains transformed to purple peaks, and the tawny sand gradually grew more and more orange. Overhead, the sky became a watercolor of pinks, purples, yellows, and oranges, all blending together and swirling to become something entirely new. The glow of the setting sun illuminated their faces as well. They felt their bodies preparing for a wonderful, relaxing night, and it brought them a sense of delight that radiated from their heads to their toes. As the sun began to sink even further behind the mountains, they settled back into their campsite, ready for their anniversary meal. Together, they gathered dry brush and wood, pooling it together to create the perfect environment for their bonfire. With the click of a lighter, the fire began to dance before their very eyes. Celeste leaned back, listening to the sweet, nostalgic crackle of the flames. She watched as they hopped from one log to the next, growing and shifting as they slowly consumed the logs. Beside her, Elliot began to get dinner ready. He set up their cooking platform and their cast iron skillet. The flames licked the edge of the cast iron as Elliot plopped their filet mignon and fresh rosemary into the pan. Now the cast iron sizzled with the cooking food, the fresh air mixed with the aroma of their dinner. Celeste felt her shoulders relax even more as she turned her attention to the sky. The sun was about to disappear completely until tomorrow. As it finally sank fully behind the mountains, the black sky above became clear. Stars that she had never seen before were splashed across the inky black sky. She couldn't help but think it was the darkest night she had ever seen. Here, this far from the city, there was so little light pollution that you could see almost every star in the sky. The mere sight of it took her breath away. Elliot took her hand as they both gazed up at the universe. It felt like a sacred moment they were sharing together, something they would never forget. They gazed up at the sky in silence for what seemed like hours. Around them, the soundscape changed. Along with the crackle of the fire and the food, the chirps of desert insects filled the air. There was the low buzz of cicadas and the melodic song of grasshoppers off hiding in the bushes somewhere. They ate their dinner on camping plates that had followed them around the globe. The taste splashed across their tongues, filling them with joy. Celeste leaned against Elliot's chest as they ate, truly enjoying this moment in each other's company. Once they had eaten, Elliot put a kettle over the fire. The sweet smell of chocolate milk danced through the air. The smell combined with the sounds around them made Celeste feel particularly sleepy. As Elliot poured the hot chocolate, the steam rose over his face. He sighed dreamily as he handed Celeste a cup. Still in their peaceful silence, they sipped on the hot chocolate. With night reaching its peak, they put out their campfire, wanting for the comfort of their sheets instead. The flames sizzled and disappeared, leaving charred logs in their place. Elliot removed the fly from their tent. When they crawled inside, they were met with the same stunning view of the clear night sky. Overhead, the Big Dipper seemed to shine even brighter than usual. After a long day of hiking and driving, the mats underneath them felt heavenly. They pulled the blankets up around themselves and huddled together, their gaze shifting between the sky and each other. They breathed in rhythm as they held one another, savoring the brilliant simplicity of this moment together. Outside, they could still hear the crickets chirping, the owls calling into the crisp air. They felt as though they were a part of it. Elliot's arms comforted Celeste. She curled up against him, resting her head on his chest. The beat of his heart lulled her closer and closer to sleep. It was a sound that would always comfort her, maybe even more than the brilliant sounds of Joshua Tree at night. They both felt their eyes flutter closed. With her last bit of energy, Celeste took Elliot's hand in hers. "I love you," she mumbled. A smile pulled at the edge of Elliot's lips. He squeezed her hand back and muttered, "I love you too." I hope you have enjoyed this sleep story and it has led you to a night of peaceful, deep sleep. Please join me again tomorrow for another sleep story.